Welcome to Logger Lectures Online, part of our series of digital lectures presented by the McMaster Alumni Association. These in-person and online lectures are named after McMaster graduate Albert Abram Logger, a great believer in the value of lifelong education. He created the Albert Abram Logger Foundation, which supports several organizations in their efforts, including the McMaster Alumni Association.
Unstructured search, and these algorithms were designed to Good afternoon. My name is Chris Gajansky from the alumni team at McMaster University. Thanks for joining us today. We are always working to support our alumni and friends in their pursuit of lifelong learning. And today, I'm so pleased to be welcoming you to this talk by the Royal Botanical Gardens experts. The RBG, as we call them, are our neighbors, and they're an important part of our community. And you may have been lucky enough to have visited one of their many beautiful gardens. They're also important on a larger scale. They've been recognized as a World Biosphere Reserve by UNESCO. They're the largest botanical garden in Canada, and they're a National Historic Site. Although the current visitors to RBG are enjoying the fall gardens, we're looking ahead to the winter and thinking about how we can make the most use of the time we've been given in this pandemic through the winter. A little bit of housekeeping about questions during the talk. We got a lot of questions, and you will be able to ask questions during the webinar using the button at the bottom of your screen. So we're going to do our very best to get to all of them, but please don't be upset if we can't do so. And I'm just going to get right into it because there are so many questions and there's so much information that we want to convey. I'm pleased to introduce you to Karin Davidson-Taylor, who's an education officer at the RBG, and her colleague, Charlie Briggs, who's a gardening expert in the Arboretum at the RBG.
Thanks very much, Chris, and welcome everybody to Royal Botanical Gardens from Charlie and myself. Before we get started though, just for some of you who may not know where we are, I'm going to switch over and show you where we are in perhaps relation to where some of you are. But this lovely big red dot, that is Royal Botanical Gardens. So we're about an hour from Niagara Falls, about an hour from Toronto. And let me just go a little bit closer, because some of you may have been a while since you've been to Royal Botanical Gardens. But we are a part of the Hamilton municipality as well as Burlington's municipality. And I'm just going to, with my mouse, just briefly try and sort of show you a sort of an outline of our property. And yep, we are right behind McMaster, right down there. Princess Point all the way around. So in case you don't know, we've got about 2,700 acres or 1,100 hectares or 11 square kilometers, or as someone also said, about 6,000 hockey rinks. That's how big we are. And of that area, only between sort of a ninth or a tenth of it is gardens. The rest is natural lands or natural sanctuaries. So we have 4 outdoor garden areas and 1 indoor garden area. So if you're not sure, we've got the Arboretum right here. We've got Rock Garden right here, which is our inaugural garden and actually relatively newly renovated. We've got Laking Garden right here, well known for its irises and peonies. And then we've got Hendry Garden right here, Hendry Park, which actually is a quite a large combination of different types of gardens, including our newly renovated Rose Garden, our Veggie Village, our Global Garden, and our Helen M. Kipax garden here, Woodland Garden, which or a garden which has got a lot of native plants, as well as our Woodland Garden that is right down here. So a lot of outdoor spaces, and then right here is the Mediterranean Garden. But a lot of our talk today and a lot of the answers that Charlie's going to give to your questions are those related to our cultivated gardens, but you know, there might be some related to natural spaces as well. One of the questions that I'm going to answer right away, and Charlie will too, is a little bit about our careers and the path that we're on. I am an education officer. I have a degree from the University of Guelph in zoology, and I have a degree which I received about 15 years after that from Brock in their education department. I didn't start out doing this. I was a classroom teacher, both for adults and children. I worked with computers a lot, and I was an amateur naturalist. Eventually, with all those experiences, this is where I am now. And I've been doing interactive virtual programs to students since 2007 globally. So I've done programs to every single province and every single territory. I've done it to almost every single state in the United States, as well as to places like South Korea, Guam, England, all of Great Britain, actually, Germany. So it's been quite a wide reach that Royal Botanical Gardens has, which is really important because we want to share with people how important biodiversity and plants are in our lives, being one of Canada's biodiversity hotspots. So I'm going to turn things over to Charlie. He's going to introduce himself, and we'll together answer some of your questions.
Hi, everyone. I'm Charlie Briggs. I'm another gardener employee of Royal Botanical Gardens. I've been working there for about 10 years. And as Karin mentioned, I work as an arborist and a gardener in the Arboretum currently. But I spent the time at RBG working in a number of the different areas. And between my time in those gardens and at my own home residence and other people's properties, today I'm going to be sharing with you a lot of the knowledge I've amassed and a lot of things I've learned in regard to how we can be preparing for winter in our gardens and what else we can be doing during the cold season as well. So I'm going to switch over to our small presentation here we have for you. And we're going to see how much content we can cover in about an hour. So the first item I wanted to mention was there was some questions about the hardiness zones, what we can grow and what we can work with in different areas of Canada. So on this map down here, if you can see in the bottom, right where Hamilton area is, just south of Toronto, we have kind of this darker orange color here, and this puts us in a hardiness zone area known as 6A. And what the hardiness zones mean is when we select plants that for purchase that we can grow, this number is telling us what Agriculture Canada has designated as the most cold those plants can tolerate. So having a 6A means that the plants that we have for this location is quite warm. So there's a lot more we can grow than we can in given other sections. So say if you're from the Ottawa area, you're a couple of zones a little cooler. So you have slightly less items that you can work with as far as plant material necessarily, but not too much of a difference. But down in Hamilton here, we're in the kind of banana belt section wrapped around the Niagara Escarpment. So we have a very, very protected location of interesting things that we can grow down here. So let's just keep in mind when you're looking at different plants, and as we continue this conversation, although we're all in Ontario, there are some slight differences that we can and can't get away with depending on the different plant material and even the vegetables we're going to discuss a bit. So trying to stay on target for our talk today. It's been a really beautiful autumn. It's been wonderful weather, and it's hard to think about that the cold weather is coming, but even with this really nice weather we've been having in Southern Ontario, we've still already dropped all of our leaves, mostly off our trees. There's a few remaining and still continuing, right? But as far as all the gardeners are concerned at their houses and their homes and where they're working, it's already time to start all that regular leaf cleanup and what we're going to be cutting down, what we're going to be removing, and how we're going to be tending our gardens so far. So the first thing I want to mention here is always the big question on people's minds as we talk about further sustainable gardening is what can we be doing with all the leaf drop from these trees? So the important thing to remember is that we're trying to work towards and away from, I should say, the idea of gathering all our leaves and having them just taken off of our property. So we're encouraging you to use your leaves as much as you can as kind of a natural mulch. And so you can use those in your garden beds. You can use them under tree wells. And that's just to keep your areas insulated and warm. You can do that just temporarily, or you can leave them permanently for the following season to be used as a natural mulch. And the reason for this is that this is kind of a free fertilizer. So there's a lot of items, not just the organic matter, but a lot of nutrients that are being dropped by these plants and the trees on your property that those plants specifically want back as intended. So as opposed to us removing a lot of that matter and then paying to bring in other forms of fertilizer, it's really just a free version that we can accept and keep on our property. The other item we're talking about this time of year as we're cleaning up is how much herbaceous material we can leave on some of our perennial plants that are standing upright. So there's a conversation a lot lately about what we can leave for the pollinators and the insects on our properties. So I'm going to hand this off to Karin in a moment here, but I'm going to show one example of, actually, sorry, Karin, do you want to start with the pollinator aspect there, and then I'll finish up with the oversized photo of my giant sunflower here?
Exactly, because actually what I'll do is I'm going to go back to the leaves for a second, and I'm going to interrupt your sharing, okay? Because
Please.
I want to share I want to share my document camera, because I have something here that is related to those leaves that people are raking up. Some of you may recognize this little woolly bear. Well, that little woolly bear caterpillar is actually going to have to go through about 2 or 3 winters before it is large enough to make its cocoon in the spring. But where it tends to go are places on the edges of your garden where probably some of those leaves have been gathered, because that's a great spot for it to stay. So a woolly bear is going to take advantage. If you start scraping away those leaves, you could very well be scraping away some of those insects that use that leaf litter or those edges of your yard or your garden as a safe place to be. Now, the other thing I wanted to show you, and I'll just lift it up here because Charlie had a lovely big plant, and let me just stop sharing for a second so you can see it. He's going to show you a beautiful picture of gigantic, there we go. He's got a lovely picture there of the gigantic sunflowers, Helianthus gigantus. And this is what they look like in the summer. This is what they look like in the fall. And what's wonderful about them is we have had so many birds taking advantage, especially the goldfinches, taking advantage of all these seed heads and and taking those seeds. There's barely anything left on my plants. They've just been having a real field day. The other thing about it is that this plant has actually also got, it's also great for pollinators as a place for those pollinators to have possibly laid their eggs earlier in the summer. This will be an overwinter place for those larvae, or depending on the species of bee, it could be the place for the pupated larva, or possibly for the adult that's overwintering there, getting ready to come out in the spring. So we might talk a little bit more about how insects use these plants, but for now, I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you, Karin. So talking about herbaceous perennials, the reason I bring up this giant sunflower example is because there's a lot of conversation that Karin and myself focus on in the gardening world in general right now, and that's using a lot of native plants. And as many native plants as we can bring in our property, and how we're kind of pushing that idea further, a lot of these plants, they naturally grow a lot larger than the stuff that we typically put in our gardens. And the reason for that is the garden plants that we normally have, they've been cultivated over some of them centuries or 1,000 years to be nice little small formed, beautiful plants for our garden. So now that we understand that we should be using more native plant material, and we try bringing these items in, such as this giant sunflower, 2 examples here in the photo, one in my backyard, one in my front yard on my small little 30 by 60 backyard property in downtown Hamilton, is that we end up with these very large sections such as this. So as wonderful as this plant is, like others I have, and I want to show them off in my yard, it gets upwards sometimes of 13 feet tall. So you see it reaching over this 6-7 foot fence here I have with my neighbor, and I have it tied up. So all the work that it's doing in the summer and all the work it's doing in the fall as it feeds those finches, as we watch them, as Karin said she did with her own specimen there. When it comes wintertime, especially this example I have in my front yard, this photo from when before we had our driveway reconstructed, that is a plant that I still have there next to our front porch, and where one of our car gets backed into. So I can't leave that plant necessarily that large. So as much as we want to leave all the plant material that we can for insects to use to overwinter, is that there's going to be examples like this where I have to decide, okay, there's a certain amount of this plant I'm going to have to cut down because it's going to become so unwieldy and kind of inhibiting the regular function of working around my house. So these plants, this is photos from in the summer or previous years. What these actually look like now is that I've cut them down to about 4 or 5 foot tall stalks. So I've left them as long as possible, right up until this week, and they've been picked clean by the birds so far. And as I was using that nice weather to garden around my house, I haven't just cut them completely to the ground and bagged them and taken them away. So I've removed the top end of that material that I have to. I've left it in the garden, and I've left as much upstanding section as I can that isn't just going to flop over in the winter snow or get in the way. So you don't have to completely remove your plants and cut them down to the ground. And you also don't have to leave everything large on your property. So I always like to say to different gardeners, because you're considering what works for your property, as well as sometimes what your neighbors see fit, depending if you're a front yard garden, is the rule of thumb is to leave as much as you prefer, as much as you can. So as much area as we can possibly do, we do that. So for the past few years, I've been leaving these plants at 5 foot stalks, and we're still happy to see birds coming throughout the winter and picking away at the insects that have been overwintering inside. So some of them will continue on to next year. Some will feed the birds through the winter as well. So it's kind of finding that balance.
Charlie, can I show some of the stems that I've got?
Please.
Okay, so I'm just gonna, actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch cameras. And because what I have here are, I have some stalks from other years, and these are the big black raspberry stalks. So you can see how thick they are. So when the raspberries were finished, we actually cut some of these. And then what I did is I just collected them and put them, in a pile, sort of very tightly wrapped. So there was no wiggling. But you can see there's holes in them, and those holes are made by the bees. Could be mason bees, could be leafcutter bees. They'll have made their holes. They will have dug that pithy center out. So if you have a plant that's got a pithy center, like this blackberry cane or this gigantic, so that's got a pithy center. If you've got something like that, if you cut them down, that's not a problem. Just, even if you cut them down so that if you can leave about a foot, if you have to cut them down, if you can leave at least a foot of that plant left, and then just leave the rest of the plant close by, then the birds will find the seeds. And the other thing I've got here is some asters, and you can see that the birds have cleaned this aster right off. I've got purple coneflower here. They've cleaned it right off. And then even my goldenrod. This is a busy place with all these plants, but if you provide it, they will come. So I'll switch back my camera.
Thank you, Karin. Yeah. So perfect. So leaving as much as we possibly can. Even if it's in large specimens, leave what you want. That's a big part of the winter gardening, is to be able to provide. One of the questions we get pretty often is what else can we do for birds through the winter? And there was some research done pretty recently where it was actually determined in Oregon, where this was done, with a mild winter, but still the amount of bird seed you offer to birds doesn't necessarily increase their survivability through the winter. So you're not increasing the number of birds through the winter, and which ones will continue, how many more will be born by providing them with that much more seed. So the big thing is to actually have more native plant material left up for different insects to actually continue their life cycle and to be found by those birds through the winter. So that's the big thing that you can actually do if you want to be providing to birds and other animals. is leaving that native plant material up as much as you possibly can. So something else we can do as we get ready for winter, and another question we get quite often is this a good time to be planting and dividing plant material? So the answer is always, you can do any gardening as long as the soil is workable. So the plants have conditioned themselves to be ready for what their current circumstance is. So as long as you're not pulling a plant out of a greenhouse, or you're pulling a plant off a truck that was just shipped up from Florida, if you're working with a plant that is already dormant, it's been out in your garden, or it's come from your friend's garden, you're dividing it and you're planting it, any of that can be done when the soil is workable. So that includes, like this photo I have from my back rain garden with these blue flag iris that are perfectly happy in that hard Hamilton clay. This is actually a photo of them going through the drought this summer. So even though they are a water-centered plant, they're a very adaptable native plant that can deal even with those harsh conditions. So those are iris in this photo that I have yet, and I'll probably actually do this weekend. I'll be digging those up and dividing them to make kind of a bigger batch in this garden, as well as to offer some of them to friends and family. And that can be done, again, right until there's a hard enough frost that I can't get a spade or a trowel into the ground. So any time is good for that. Often you'll actually see cities and municipalities planting trees in the depths of winter, because a tree has a root ball that is so deep that if they backhoe a boulevard to put a tree in the ground, they're digging through that frost layer, putting the tree in a dormant state, that as soon as spring comes, it wakes up and gets growing again. So it's fine to do that in any condition. And often we leave a lot of our gardening work for the spring when there's stuff that can be done in the fall. And this can actually benefit a lot of the plants too, because if you're thinking about when you go into the garden center or a plant sale in the spring, you're actually missing out on many weeks, sometimes a couple of months of growing time. Whereas if you get that work done in the fall, those plants are ready to start growing, have that extra bit of vigor and get going for you as soon as the temperature decides that they're ready to do that in the springtime. So you can save yourself some work. So the big thing to remember is when the plant goes in the fall, even if it's a cooler temperature, you have to make sure that plant is watered thoroughly. And the reason for that is it wants to take up a good amount of moisture to protect itself through the cold and through the winter. And come springtime, that watering it thoroughly in the fall is going to stop you from potentially losing that plant, because if you do what I've done on a consistent basis, you forget about a lot of the things you did in the fall. And so you may lose things if you didn't prepare them exactly come the fall time and get ready for the spring. So another question we had was, do you need to water during that midwinter thaw? If the plant starts to, if the soil is workable enough, do I have to worry about that plant? And unless it's a very particular circumstance, I would say you do not have to do that. So if the plant's been watered thoroughly in the fall, even if it's a new item just put into the ground, I wouldn't worry about it. It has enough to carry it through to the springtime and continue on there. So another big item we talk about for the fall, as well as late winter, I should say, not quite early spring, something you can do outside of the harsh weather, is soil amendment. And this is a big item for the fall as well, because just like talking about planting and division is something that we usually leave until the springtime, but is a really good time to take advantage of this in the fall if you can acquire material. So often there'll be compost sales from the city or other different vendors, and it's only available in the springtime. But if you can get a hold of this in the fall, it's a great time to start amending. And the reason for that is the same reason that I said you should be putting plants in the ground in the fall, because they get that jump start on the springtime. And that's the same thing for this, is that we don't tend to think about all the other organisms in the soil and what's kind of functioning, but there's a whole separate world going on there. When we add compost, and compost being the biggest thing we can add for our vegetables as well as some other garden plants, is we're actually creating that beautiful little world that's going to help everything else grow. So when we get that functioning in the fall and get that jump start on the springtime for when it heats up and gets working, all that is benefited. Those nutrients become that much more readily available and that much easier for your plants, your vegetables, and other things to take up come springtime. So it's even a big recommendation for turf maintenance. If people are still keeping lawns, it's a fall fertilizer schedule is actually one of the best things you can do. So that goes for lawns, as you'll see recommended oftentimes by hardware stores or different brands. But that's the same principle that's used for our vegetables and the rest of our garden. So if we can add different items and amend our soils in the fall, that's the great time as well. And again, whenever the soil is workable. So if you have a thaw in February or January and you can get that going, that's a great time to do that as well. So talking about soil amendments of items you should be adding, anything that has a high organic amount, so mushroom compost being a really good one. Locally here, City of Hamilton and Halton region have been offering compost in the springtime. They've both been a really good batch that people have recommended to add. I personally have had luck in these last few years with mushroom compost being added, and I was only able to obtain it in the springtime, but it worked out very, very well and got everything growing quite happily. So as far as our actual garden beds and what we should be amending, my recommendation is always to amend as little as you actually need in your garden. And I showed you the photo just before of those blue flag iris being extremely happy. So personally in my backyard and how we're kind of making our way at RBG is we are adding a lot more native plant material. And doing so is we have a lot less rigorous soil requirements with those plants. So those plants are very happy growing in these clay conditions or these minimal nutrient conditions. So at my house, I didn't have to amend any of the soil originally to get a large section of native plant gardens growing or other items. So these plants are very adaptable. And it was just one single batch of mulch that was added on the first year. And then after that, they've just been mulching and kind of composted with the own litter that they're dropping. So they're their own plant material. So, Karin, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I'm sort of going yes, thumbs up to
Okay.
to everything you've said, because I mean, and you mentioned the leaves from the very beginning. I mean, and it doesn't, but you know, if you've got a composter at home, take advantage of that too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Okay. So jumping on to the next section there. And the biggest thing we can do in the winter is our actual pruning. And this is the best time to get a lot of things done. So as I say here, most trees and shrubs, they should be pruned in the winter. And the one big reason for that, outside of them being dormant and them happy to deal with a wound in that current situation, is it's very limiting to the amount of pests and disease that are available. So every year that goes on in the gardening world, we keep hearing about another potential issue that's affecting our trees or our shrubs. And winter is the best time to prune because those diseases and those pathogens and those insects, they're less likely to come in and harm our trees and shrubs at that time of year. So a big one right now we're seeing is oak wilt and sudden oak death are two problems, that are starting to affect our oak trees that's kind of making their way up from the States. And the way that sudden oak death works is that it's actually a disease that is carried by a certain type of beetle that is attracted to the sap that runs on oak trees. So if the trees are cut when they're dormant, if you absolutely must make a cut to a tree and prune it, if you do it in the wintertime when it is dormant, then it's less likely that the sap is running, the beetles are less active. So with those two factors, we're less likely to actually continue carrying that disease and spreading it amongst our oak trees. So that's the same principle that's used for a lot of our pruning. One of the difficult things you can do in the winter is it's tough to notice what is dead wood and what is live wood, and depending on the size of the tree, what you can see and what you can reach. So if you can remove the dead wood from your trees when they have leaves on or the rest of the season, then you can use the winter to focus on structure of the trees and what pruning you can do. Big thing to remember if you're pruning in the winter is you need to watch out you're not removing blooms for the following year. So plants that set buds in the fall or the winter and get ready for that spring bloom, such as our lilacs and magnolias, the two big collections we have at our Arboretum in Botanical Gardens, is we don't want to go through the winter pruning and removing anything that's going to stop our bloom show for the following season. So there are specific examples like magnolias and lilacs where we're going to do a lot of our pruning on those plants after they've bloomed. So we don't remove a certain amount of them. We only prune as necessary on those two species of plants. Another one to avoid if you're cutting in late winter is to avoid plants that have a heavy amount of sap running. So birches and maples. So the same way that we tap our maple trees to get the maple syrup run come springtime, if we were to prune our maples that late into winter when the sap is starting to run, then we're going to leave large open wounds where that sap's going to be coming out of. And so they're more likely to have an issue with a certain fungus or a different disease, and they're more likely to stain their bark. So those are trees that we want to prune in late fall and early winter, those birches and those maples. So answering a few other questions that came up before, roses, which is a big one at RBG as well. We know we should be pruning our roses in the springtime and choosing our canes to give them the structure that we want to put on the best show. But what can we do in the fall? Because some of the roses get so large and they break and they fall over in the winter and they get snow loaded. So what can we do? So the answer to that is, as our roses die down to just a small amount of live wood each year in Southern Ontario and other sections of Canada too, what we do at RBG and what I do with my roses at home is we're able to cut down those roses just far enough that we know we're not going to be cutting into live wood surviving for the following year. So usually about 2 feet off of the ground, we can cut all those canes down if they're going to stand too large. And then come spring, once we see what live wood is left, then we'll be doing our actual final pruning. One of the other questions we had was about raspberry suckers or blackberry suckers. So winter is a good time to cut off anything on a raspberry or blackberry plant, any of those thorny items that just have too much going on and it isn't a stem that's going to be providing fruit for the following year. So we can remove those as well. And winter is a great time for rejuvenation pruning. So things like our dogwoods, or red osier dogwoods, or gray dogwoods, or forsythia, items that you want to just completely regrow the following year, you can cut those right to the ground in the winter. So talking about how great it is a time to do that pruning, let's quickly just take a look at what type of pruning we can be doing in the winter when I mentioned structurally. So this says pruning fruit trees. This can go for just about any tree we just acquire or something you've let grow on too long here. So these first two items here are trees that we've just received from the nursery or we're just starting to prune. So we see a tree that has more than 1 leader. So more than one branch that is carrying its way onto the sky to kind of create its form. So what we're going to go do here in the wintertime pruning is we're going to remove any of those sections there that are co-dominant, that are competing with that one main leader. So now we're left with just a couple of stems. So come springtime or come the next year, 1 year later, you see where those single stems are now branched off into other little sections, but nothing is fighting with that single leader that's carrying up skyward there. And the reason we want that is because, as we see here in the fourth section, is we're going to end up with a really nice looking plant that has good form and has strong form. So it doesn't have branches that are competing with each other that are more likely to fail because of how tight those unions are, as opposed to what we see in the bottom section of the slide here, where enough branches were not properly pruned in the wintertime and they've grown co-dominantly, they've competed with each other, and they've created a tree now that has weaker unions in those sections. So one last thing about our pruning here, just so everyone's prepared to go through the wintertime. If we have a branch that is so large that we can't just hold it in one hand and saw it or clip it off with the other, we want to make sure we're not leaving a wound in the winter that can then be cause an issue come springtime. So this is the preferred pruning cut method here. It's called the ABC cut. If you want to remove this entire branch outside of this branch collar that we see here on the left, where it kind of flares outwards, we first want to start with a small undercut on the bottom. Our second cut goes outwards of the branch here. We can saw right through. And the reason we do that first cut there, it's going to stop any bark stripping and leaving a wound that carries down. So once we cut that off there, we're left with this nub. And our third cut, the C cut here, we're going to continue off right at the branch collar, exactly, to finish it off. So that's just a quick intro there to send you on your way and give you the best chance with your winter pruning. So I hope you find good structure amongst your woody specimens there.
Charlie, can I just interrupt for a second? Because
Please.
we've got a couple of questions that have come through, and some of them are related to what we've just been talking about. One of them was about compost, and they were asking, do you dig the compost into the soil or just put it on the top? And when I've done it, I've just put it on the top. Because you have to be careful about what you dig in, because remember, your soil is a very biodiverse area, and you need all those little tiny beasties in your soil to help break down any plants. So you don't want to sort of dig it too much and expose them to cooler temperatures. What about, do you want to add something to that too?
Yeah, and I'll show that in a few more slides here when we talk about vegetables. You can use that compost to insulate, as you said, the garden throughout the winter, depending on what you have growing and what needs to decompose. If you have nothing going currently in the garden, I will till in those items in the fall. And just because that mixes that in, and that can actually feed that biome we're talking about down there with all those microorganisms, and that can get them ready for the springtime. So there isn't a wrong answer to that, I should say. So you can leave it on the top of the soil and it will leach through with the remaining warm days and through the winter, and it'll insulate, as well as you can mix it in if you so decide. And it depends what you're doing with that garden as well, right? So I'd say for vegetables, if you don't have garlic and other bulbs carrying through the winter, you can mix them in, or in the garden situation with the plants that are permanently stayed in there, it's good to add it on top and let it insulate and let it do its thing, and then it's ready for the springtime to decompose and continue to mix itself into the garden. So rarely is there a situation in the garden where we should be mixing stuff in directly. We should be letting it do its own thing and kind of make its way into the soil, I'd say. Is that good, Karin?
Yeah, there's another question, and it has to do about Japanese maple, but I don't know if you're going to be talking about this later on. It is about winterizing this Japanese maple. I'm wondering, are you going to be talking about sort of winterizing trees in general, or have we sort of talked about that with?
Yeah, we didn't mention it. So yeah, going back to the hardiness zones, there's certain plants that we do try to grow in sections where they wouldn't normally. So Japanese maple being one of them. So in Southern Ontario, especially down in the Niagara Way, but even in Hamilton and Toronto, there's a lot of beautiful examples of Japanese maples. So there's a number of species of Japanese maples, some a little bit hardier than others, and they're always best when you see them in a protected location. So depending on the size of your plant, how large it is, how mature, if it's a pendula, if it's a weeping form, you do have the option to protect it kind of using a burlap wrap on a couple of posts, protect it from those cold winter winds, which are going to kill off the majority of the buds and kind of affect the shape for the following season. So that's to go back to those hardiness zones. Know what plant you're buying, know what species it is, how that relates to your hardiness zone where you live, and that will tell you how protected that Japanese maple needs to be, because we could get a cold snap, we could get an ice storm again, and that could really run its course and remove some of those plants you've been trying to grow. So you need to be aware of what you have.
Yeah, this actually, so there's one question that best time to trim back lilacs.
So yeah, the lilacs and the magnolias, as I was saying before, I will prune them just after they bloom if something needs to be done. There aren't too many issues between the magnolias and the lilacs that can be affected by pruning cuts. Like, we do sanitize as we're working, just to be sure that we're not sharing any diseases amongst like the large collections. But lilac is just one where you need to avoid pruning too much in the winter, because it has already set its buds for the springtime as well, as I was saying earlier. So just after it blooms, if you need to make some changes. And then in the winter, if you know you're removing a couple of buds, you can make those big structural changes to those plants.
Okay. This other question has to do with the leaves that we talked about a little bit earlier. So its question is, leaves even after they are chopped up by the lawnmower break down very slowly, and inevitably I have to bag and dispose of them. Yeah. How much nutritive benefit is there, aside from winter insulation, to leaving leaves on gardens only over the winter?
It depends on the plant. I'm not sure if we've done the research on which ones contain more nutrients than others. But again, that brings me to what I mentioned earlier when we were talking about leaf fall, as well as how much perennial or herbaceous material we can leave up. Just leave what you can and what's convenient for you and what you're able to leave. So the more you can in the gardens, the more you have that you can use to mulch it and to allow it to amend your own soils like that, do so. But if you're finding items that are taking time to break down, such as oak leaves and beech leaves that specifically stay and take a while to actually break down in our gardens, then remove them if you absolutely have to. Compared to what other plants can drop, we're not sure what the nutrient breakdown is that necessarily. We know it is a free form of fertilizer, but again, if it's just becoming an inconvenience to you, then don't worry about trying to keep it going if it's just blowing around in your gardens and lawns come springtime.
Okay, so I've got a couple more questions, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to save these ones.
Yeah.
One is about mushroom compost, so I know you're going to talk about compost a little later on, so we're going to save that one. And then
Okay.
the other one is about grasses, and because you're talking about winter interest, food, and color,
Yes.
well, I'll save that grasses one till after you finish this next part.
Okay, great. Because we don't. I have a couple slides here, and one doesn't include the grasses. So yeah, we'll jump back to this. So winter interest, food, and color. What can make our garden not only available to the birds in the wintertime, but also what can make it more aesthetically pleasing. So this is a tough one to kind of keep our garden for seasons. So let's talk about the items that can really help us out with that color and that interest. So on this slide here, the photo I have is from our witch hazel collection at the Arboretum. And so this is a Hamamelis mollis. It's a witch hazel. So there's a few introduced witch hazels that will actually bloom in the wintertime and early spring. So it'll give us this color show before anything else in the garden has started to kind of get going. And we have our own native witch hazel that has a bloom in late fall. So it's just finishing up its bloom right now. So a lot later than other items we'll see. Plants that have a kind of berry that can keep you going, and we'll see a photo of the snowberry later. We have beautyberry as well. Those are items that will feed the birds throughout the winter, just so barely. We don't see birds eating too much on the beautyberry. We see them more eating on the viburnums and other native plants, but that will add some interest to your garden, as well as red osier dogwoods and birch. And another big item we add to our gardens are evergreens, such as Japanese yews and native hemlocks. So here's a couple of photos we have of those interesting bark specimens. So on the left here, we have a near native plant. This is the river birch. So a cousin of our paper birch, but can often be a smaller plant with more branching. And it has kind of a nice red color to it here. We'll hear it called a red birch at times as well. And then on the right, we have an example of one of our native dogwoods that grows all the way across Canada and throughout most of the United States. So that's red osier dogwood, or its cousin, the silky dogwood. And that's a plant that adds color there's nothing to rival it in the winter garden. So it's quite the specimen. And there's a lot of interesting cultivars that can add deeper color to that dogwood as well. There's cultivars of the river birch if you're looking for a smaller example or a full size example as well. So that's one of the best ways that we can start to add to that winter color, that winter interest, as well as one of my favorites here, using dwarf conifers. So Japanese yew, something I said earlier, that is one of the most common items you'll see used in commercial landscapes or common landscapes across North America is Japanese yews. What we have to use if we're still trying with our native plants or more local plants is there's a couple of dwarf forms of those species that grow around here normally. One of my all-time favorites is on the left here is actually a cultivar called Mini Twist, pardon me, that is a cultivar of the white pine. So a really interesting example that fits into our gardens. And on the right here is kind of a compact weeping form of our native eastern hemlock called Jetalo. So those are two that are common from different nurseries. So there's a lot available in the nursery trade and easy to access. You could also try, as I have in my backyard, in my small, just 30-foot wide backyard, of planting a straight species hemlock with the idea that we're going to prune it and kind of have it keep its shape as it grows larger. Pardon me. So you can get away, but that's one of the best ways to add the color to it.
So just quickly to go back to the question about the grasses, it was the fact that RBG leaves their ornamental grasses uncut over the winter at rock gardens, and this person sort of wants to find out if it's because they don't cut them in the fall. Is there a reason? So I'm assuming that this is that they should not be cut back in the fall.
Yeah, depending on which plant. So out front of the rock garden, there's two different examples. There's an example of a Chinese introduced grass that's left up just for ornamental value, as well as there's the native version of a panicum. And so that plant is left for not only its winter interest, has a nice view as you're driving along Plains Road, but also that is a native plant that does have a couple of relationships with wasp and bees in the area. So it does provide some habitat to those plants as well. So grasses, introduced and native one, are a great way to kind of keep that interest going in your garden as well.
Mm-hmm. This question, and it's sort of a combination of what we just covered and a little bit before. This person has a treed backyard on a ravine, mostly sugar maples. We have a lot of 8 to 10 foot saplings in the undergrowth. Should we thin out the number of saplings in the fall?
I would not worry about that unless there's a use that you have for that section. I would just let the sugar maples do as they're doing. They will thin themselves out as they mature and get growing. So there's only a certain amount of those that you see that are actually going to make it to maturity. So it's important that you leave as many that are there. So it's going through its own natural function of starting off with so many saplings, and then those will be reduced over time between deer damage and climate. And as they mature, and there's only going to be so many that make it. So I would just enjoy watching the natural process of that. Good.
Okay, so we'll continue on.
All right, thank you, Karin. So winter vegetables. One of the biggest things we can do to do actual gardening in the winter. So beyond pruning, how can we keep our actual garden function going? So one of the big ways to do that is the use of what's called a cold frame. So a vegetable dugout, as in this photo here, with a small raised bed, not so much a raised bed as in just a section of wood around it to support the top awning to create this kind of miniature greenhouse that we have going. So you want this as low to the ground as you can, because it will insulate the soil. As you're closer to the ground, you're not going to get as much cold, so it's going to allow you to continue grow throughout the season there. Pardon me. And so the way that works is it has kind of a polyglass top, and that's going to allow a lot of sunlight in through the top there to heat up that section and keep your growing season going. So as you see in this photo here, in this example that comes from savvygardening.com, where I have a link on here, and we'll share it with you after as well, to find the instructions to building a small cold frame as this. You see a lot of brassicas, the kale family members, and the reason that those are used in this photo and those are recommended is because those are the most cold hardy variety of plants that we can keep gardening with through the season. So even if your garden isn't protected in this cold frame structure, as I'll show you in the next couple slides here, you can keep brassicas going late through the fall, if not the whole winter, actually, if it's quite mild, as well as starting them up very early in the spring there. And so another note I have there is just raised beds, which I showed you a photo of mine earlier that are 2 or 3 feet off the ground. They actually, as convenient as they are the rest of the season for gardening, those will actually freeze earlier and longer because they're exposed to the winter air on all sides. So something to consider if you want to get your soil working earlier in the season, or you are thinking of putting a cold frame top on your gardens, is you do want it lower to the ground there. And the other way you can add some, which is kind of the exact same principle as the cold frame top, which is convenient usually on a smaller scale, is you can add these hoop structures on a new garden or your existing one. So you can create large versions of this, as Susan in the garden did with her instructions at this link, where you can cover It's like 6-7 feet tall with big sections of PVC and then wrapped with poly, or a smaller section as in the next photo, where you can achieve the same thing. And so what this is doing is extending your season, sometimes right through the winter, or it's starting up earlier in the spring. So you're heating up that soil using that greenhouse effect and keeping it going. What you can do as well, as opposed to just starting with poly and creating its own little atmosphere, is even if you just use some fabric cloth, typically a white one of landscape fabric that lets the sunlight in, that can continue your season just by blocking the frost in those plants for the first amount that drop in November and December. You can really extend your season using that. But those are the two means to keep yours going. So this photo here of my back garden, just a couple things to note. So no cold frame top as of yet. No requests from my partner, who does the majority of the vegetables at our house actually, to install and keep the season going. So I'm sure that'll happen soon. But what we see here is a couple bamboo stakes where garlic has been planted. So that's a bulb that's going to carry through the winter. And you see some of the oak leaves from the chinkapin oak that so far have been collected. Most of them I have blown off from the chinkapin oak, where they drop them into our rain garden, off of our lawn that doesn't need much insulation, to other sections of our garden to insulate. But I was told recently that some of those will be collected to insulate the garlic throughout the winter, to make sure that in this raised bed, which if in a cold season, in a cold winter, it can get quite cold and disturb the garlic, it'll be better protected with a large layer of leaves and other plant material dropping there. So, and in these photos, which are just from this morning that I put up here, you can still see what's growing even after a couple of frosts. So on the left here, there is sections of kale, parsley that is just finishing up, but the kale we have is going to keep going for a number of weeks. And on the right here, you see another brassica family member, broccoli, which has been doing a really great job this winter. And its flowers are actually being let to fully open. Recently, we saw a chef show that was showing about kind of how delicious broccoli flowers can be, the yellows, when they open up. So we didn't harvest them when they were small as a vegetable. We're going to try out some of the flowers. And then in the section on the bottom of the right here, you can see late sowed sections of spinach. So another leafy top member that is somewhat cold hardy. So it's going to keep going for a bit, as well as the remnants of green onions that haven't been completely harvested. So the season can keep going for you quite some time. So we've had sections of kale, even in the raised beds, with these mild winters these past couple of years, where the kale has just become perennial. It's grown right through the winter and carried off into the spring, and still producing leaves. So you can get quite the time out of your garden there. Oh, and just on the right here above Roger the dog's head is the snowberry that we talked about earlier. So there's those white berries on one of our native plants that will persist throughout the winter. Most of those on this one we have in our backyard will be eaten by birds, and then it'll finish off come springtime, and they'll fall to the ground, just kind of diffuse their way into the soil there. All right, Karin, did you have anything to add on those items there before we get to some more questions?
Actually, well, I was going to say, is this a good time to ask about the compost question?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so this question is asking, where do I get mushroom compost in Hamilton? Because you did mention that earlier on. So I know there are mushroom farms locally.
Yes, I'm trying to remember the name. It's
is it on Appleby line or Guelph line, or?
It is, yeah, north of Burlington.
Yeah, and you just go around the corner and there it is. So,
it has brothers in the name, pardon me, but yeah. I can't remember to be more specific. So no. How I acquired it the past 2 years was there was one company that was actually delivering it, but some of the mushroom growers themselves will allow you to go and pick it up. So it may require a quick Google, but we'll see that is the best way to acquire it. I don't remember the exact name. Yeah. What I've done for other years so far is we did get the City of Hamilton compost, which we're surprised was fantastic. So we went to fill your own car, basically bring as many vessels as you can and take that city compost. So I know the City of Burlington or Halton municipality does the same thing. with what I heard was a great product as well, and went a long way in the vegetable gardens.
Okay. So just considering the time, there were a couple more questions, but I think some of them you've given people. There was one about hardiness zones in Calgary, and I know that perhaps we can include a link on we can give Chris the link that you can look up your own hardiness zone later on. And then so there was a question about laying sod.
Okay.
How late in the fall can you lay sod? And I think it has to do a lot with the fact that when the soil can be worked and stuff like that, and the watering of it.
Yeah, so just all I can add to that is even if there's been a frost, you can still lay sod and you can still garden as long as the soil underneath is workable. Same principle. And some of the happiest sod that I've seen at RBG and from previous years working in the private industry is sod that is laid and then has a beautiful snowfall on top of it the next day or the next few days. That's the happiest sod to wake up in the springtime and get growing. So as long as the soil underneath is happy to start taking those roots, even if that's to go dormant a couple of days later, it is very happy to wake up in the spring and get growing. So the exact same principle as any of those other herbaceous or woody plants that we're putting in the ground. So as long as the ground is accepting for it.
And just so you know, Charlie, we've had a 5-minute warning. So okay. I'm hoping we can get through most of what we have left. So I'll leave it up to you.
Yeah, so this is it here. I just added, we had so many questions about the native plants, where to acquire native plants, as I wanted to finish with this slide here. We try to be as succinct as we can to fit in with the time that we have and talk to you about winter gardening here. So the biggest recommendation or resource I can give you is if you check out the North American Native Plant Society online in the website, and they do the best job they can to show you what growers are available from which section of Ontario you are from. Another item we can recommend is a service that I've used personally and that many people have used that I know of in the Hamilton and Burlington area, and that's onplants.ca. And they will ship you native plants that you purchase online through the resource, and will ship to, as far as I see, just about anywhere in Ontario. And saying that, even if you don't use one of those services, the best way to get more native plants is to ask your nurseries and your garden centers about it and kind of put pressure on them to get more in stock to service you. So even if you have a full garden, just try and add 1 or 2 every year, and it'll just start making that shift. So thank you.
And I was going to say, take advantage of your neighbors and take advantage of share with each other. And, if there's an opportunity where where those plants are coming from, there are all sorts of plant swaps and stuff like that. So
absolutely. And that's a big thing on the NAMS website there, the North American Native Plant Society, is you can do a seed swap as well. So I encourage you to take a good look at it. So. Oh, you're on mute there, Chris, sorry.
Classic Zoom error. I'm going to be the bad guy and end things, because I'm sure we could be here for several hours answering all the questions we got. But hopefully people you gave some great broad strokes in terms of the questions that were asked. And I'm going to include all of those websites in an email that is going to go out shortly to everyone. So if you're wondering about something that Charlie talked about there, you'll find it in your inbox very shortly. So thank you so much to the two of you for all of the time and thought that you put into this presentation today. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you do want to look back at this, it was recorded, and we're going to post it on our archive talks page in about a week once it's been captioned. So enjoy the afternoon, enjoy making the most of your garden this winter, and we'll see you next time.